Welcome to Cipher Trail, where each clue carries a whisper from the past, and each whisper beckons us deeper into the unknown. Tonight, we enter the world of Sherlock Holmes in a mystery known as the code written beneath the sundial. A tranquil garden hides a sundial whose stone base bears an inscription unseen by the casual eye. Its cryptic message hints at a pact made long ago, sealed in shadows and silence. But who dares break that seal, and at what cost? Are you listening late at night or during your morning tea? Enjoy stories wrapped in riddles and secrets. You're in the right place? Subscribe to join the investigation. Light a candle, get comfortable, and let's uncover the truth. It was one of those thick-aired mornings in late October when the London fog seemed to creep indoors, draping Baker Street in a ghostly pallor. I, Dr. John Watson, had just returned from my morning constitutional and was warming my hands by the fire when Holmes, in his usual dressing gown and slippers, glanced up from the armchair with that peculiar twinkle of anticipation in his eye. "You are 5 minutes late, Watson," he remarked, without turning fully toward me. "Indeed," I replied, removing my gloves. "And how precisely did you deduce that?" Holmes gestured toward the half-smoked cigar stub smoldering in the ashtray. The angle of ash collapse indicates it burned uninterrupted for precisely 22 minutes. "You lit it upon leaving, did you not?" Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson bustled in with a silver tray and a creased envelope. "A telegram for you, Mr. Holmes. Arrived not 2 minutes ago," she said. Holmes took the envelope with a nod. He slid it open with the silver blade he kept in his cuff and read silently. I watched his eyes flicker, first with curiosity, then sharpened interest. "Watson," he said, passing me the telegram. "Read this. It appears we are summoned." The message read, "To Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street. Urgent, Sundial Courtyard, Covent Garden." Strange markings appeared beneath the statue. Local constable puzzled. Public disturbance looming. Request immediate consultation. Inspector G. Lestrade. A sundial and markings, eh? I mused aloud. Sounds more like the work of pranksters than criminals. Holmes stood, already reaching for his Inverness cape and deer stalker. And yet Lestrade, who has never once mistaken chalk for conspiracy, seems thoroughly disturbed. That, Watson, is what intrigues me. We were soon in a hansom cab, weaving through the autumnal streets of London. The air outside was filled with the damp scent of coal smoke and wet stone, a reminder of the city's incessant pulse beneath the mist. Holmes was silent, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes closed in a state of mental hibernation. I knew better than to interrupt. Upon arrival at Covent Garden, a small crowd, held back by 2 uniformed constables, greeted us. In the center of the square where the iron old Romanesque sundial stood atop its plinth, Inspector Lestrade paced irritably, his coat buttoned tight against the chill. "About time," he barked when he saw us. "This one's beyond my usual fare, Holmes. It's got the local historian muttering about druidic runes and the vicar quoting Revelation." Holmes stepped forward without responding, his gaze fixed upon the base of the sundial. As the crowd murmured behind us, I saw it too. A set of intricate markings in red ochre, sprawled beneath the dial. Not smeared like paint, but carefully etched. Symbols unfamiliar to me. Angular and severe, arranged in precise lines, forming what appeared to be, of all things, a cipher. "Remarkable," Holmes whispered. "This is no mere mischief, Lestrade. This is a message." "A message? To whom?" "To me," Holmes said, eyes glittering, "and perhaps to death itself." And so began the curious affair of the code written beneath the sundial. The morning gloom seemed to thicken around the sundial as we approached. A hush fell over the spectators, broken only by the echo of our steps against the cobblestones. Holmes crouched near the base of the stone structure, his sharp eyes darting over the strange markings while Lestrade and I stood just behind him. At a glance, the symbols reminded me vaguely of mathematical runes or perhaps archaic Greek, though none matched any script I recognized. Angular and deliberate, they were aligned in 4 short rows directly beneath the gnomon of the sundial. What struck me most was the medium. The letters appeared to be written in a deep red pigment, not quite paint, not quite blood. Holmes reached into his pocket and produced a small magnifying lens. He studied the strokes in silence. "It's too thick to be ink," he murmured. "And yet too viscous for blood, though the color is intentionally close enough to provoke discomfort. I dare say whoever composed this wanted attention, not from the masses, but from someone capable of interpretation." "Which would be you, I presume," Lestrade muttered with dry sarcasm. Holmes ignored the comment. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his coat and delicately dabbed a corner at the edge of the script. The pigment clung thickly to the fabric, leaving a streak of rust red. "Watson," he said, standing abruptly, "take a look." I stepped forward. They resemble symbols, but of no known alphabet to me. "Because it's not a direct script, it's a constructed cipher," Holmes explained. "These are what I would classify as ideogrammatic substitutions. Note the pattern, repeating characters in the 2nd and 4th lines, and this peculiar flourish here. See? That loop with the perpendicular slash. It appears only once. Whoever wrote this knew their craft." Lestrade scratched his head. "Right then, but what does it say?" Holmes's lips twitched in a faint smile. "That, Inspector, is precisely what we must discover, but it is the choice of location that interests me most. Why place such a coded message beneath a sundial in Covent Garden? Well, it was the first thing a baker saw when he opened shop at dawn. He called the constable, who thought it was some cultish nonsense. Personally, I think it's just someone trying to scare old women." Holmes stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "Then why, pray tell, is the text written in a substitution cipher used in mid-18th century espionage manuals printed in Lisbon?" Lestrade blinked. "How do you know that?" "I recognize the pattern," Holmes said coolly. "I encountered a variant of this cipher in the affair of the Portuguese envoy, which you will remember Watson documented, though we never published it due to certain diplomatic sensitivities." I nodded. That case, though brief, had nearly cost a cabinet minister his reputation. Holmes had unraveled it in 3 days. Holmes turned to the constable, a young man who looked both relieved and intimidated by our presence. "Constable, has anyone else touched the area since the discovery?" "No, sir. We roped it off straight away." "Good. I'll need a rubbing of the markings, and then I'd like access to any nearby shops that open at sunrise." Holmes spent the next half hour using a sheet of paper and soft graphite to carefully collect a full imprint of the code. He worked in absolute silence, his brow furrowed, hands steady. When he finished, he slipped the paper into his folio and turned to us. "The code, I believe, is only one part of this puzzle. There's an intention behind the placement. This sundial is not merely a public ornament. Look at its base." We followed him to the other side. At first I saw nothing but lichen and weather-stained stone. But Holmes, ever perceptive, pointed to a hairline seam along the pedestal's lower edge. "Notice anything, Watson?" I crouched. "A panel, hidden, but hinged." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. Help me, will you?" Together we eased the panel open. Inside was a shallow recess no larger than a shoebox. Within lay a folded slip of parchment tied with a black ribbon. Lestrade whistled. "Well, I'll be—" Holmes untied the ribbon, unfolding the parchment. I leaned over to read it with him. It contained only a single line, written in the same red pigment as the cipher. "When the shadow lies east and the bell chimes thrice, the gate shall open to whom the code speaks." Holmes read it aloud, then repeated it to himself with a lowered voice. A riddle within a cipher. This is no prank, gentlemen. This is a performance, and we are its intended audience. Lestrade frowned. You think this is a threat? Not a threat, Holmes said. An invitation. To what? I asked. That, dear Watson, he said, eyes twinkling, is what we shall find out. But the phrasing, when the shadow lies east, implies a time-dependent mechanism. The sundial plays an active role in whatever is meant to occur. He stepped back into the square, looking skyward. The fog had lifted slightly, and a pale shaft of sunlight broke through the mist, casting a faint shadow from the gnomon onto the plaza stones. We must observe it at noon tomorrow. That is when the shadow lies eastward. Lestrade frowned. And until then? Holmes folded the parchment carefully and tucked it into his coat. We prepare. I suggest posting a discreet watch here through the night. I shall return at dawn to measure the progression of the shadow. As for us, Watson, there's a man in Chelsea who owes me a favor. He is quite the expert in European codes and blood-based inks. We shall pay him a visit. Lestrade huffed. I'll arrange the watch, but if this turns out to be some macabre scavenger hunt, Holmes tipped his hat. Then I shall owe you an apology, but I don't believe I will. We left Covent Garden and hailed another cab, this time bound for the Embankment. Holmes was quiet during the ride, gazing at the passing streets with a contemplative expression. I could tell his mind was already in motion, assembling possibilities, dismissing implausibilities, weighing every syllable of the riddle and every flourish of the cipher. You think someone's leading you somewhere, I said. Not me, Watson. United States, and not merely anywhere. Someone has gone to considerable effort to ensure the conditions are perfect. A sundial, a time, a code. This was not composed in haste. And the purpose? That remains to be seen. But mark me, this is not the beginning of a game. He turned toward me, his face solemn now and his voice low. It is the beginning of a warning. We arrived at Chelsea just past noon, the city's heartbeat quickening as the fog thinned into mist. Our handsome cab halted before an old Georgian townhouse with ivy trailing along its iron-grated windows. Holmes stepped down first, straightened his coat, and strode to the door with uncharacteristic urgency. I followed close behind, still puzzling over the riddle that lingered in my mind like an echo. When the shadow lies east and the bell chimes thrice, the door opened before we could knock. A hunched man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers stood in the threshold, blinking rapidly. Ah, he said, voice nasal and uncertain. Sherlock Holmes, I was told you might come. Holmes extended a hand. Bartholomew Clay, I trust your eccentric genius remains intact. The man chuckled. As intact as your reputation for impossible problems. Come in. You've brought a puzzle, haven't you? We entered into a narrow hall lined with maps, calligraphy scrolls, and framed pages from forgotten alphabets. Clay led us into a study where half the walls were taken up by books, the other half by blackboards filled with symbols and slanted notations. The air smelled of ink, wax, and the faint bite of chemicals. Holmes produced the graphite rubbing of the cipher from his folio and laid it carefully on Clay's desk. I want your eye on this. Tell me what you see. Clay adjusted his spectacles and leaned in, squinting. Yes, this is no common substitution. The patterning, wait, look here. This third symbol on the second row. It's mirrored at the end of line 4. Clever, very clever. You recognize the system? Holmes asked. Not by name, but I've seen its kin in Spanish counterintelligence from the Napoleonic era. Modified polyalphabetic. It plays on phonetic substitution but masks repetition through interlinear rotation. Could you translate it? I asked. Eventually, yes. But not here. Not in the time you need. He glanced toward Holmes. You want this by tomorrow noon, I imagine. Before the sundial casts its eastern shadow, Holmes said. Clay blinked at him, then laughed quietly. "You're caught in something peculiar, aren't you? I've learned not to ask." "I'll arrange for a courier to retrieve your findings tomorrow morning," Holmes said, already standing. "Whatever you can crack before then will be of immense value." Clay nodded, rolling the parchment with great care. "Leave it with me. Oh, and one curiosity, Mr. Holmes. This ink or pigment, was it painted recently?" Holmes tilted his head. "Likely within the last day." "Why?" Clay walked to his bench and opened a tin of reagents. He dipped a glass rod into a vial, then dabbed it against the graphite rubbing. The red line darkened and began to smoke faintly. "Mercuric sulfide," he said. "Cinnabar base. Ancient alchemists used it in ceremonial script, Chinese and Persian both. It's toxic in high doses. Not something one finds in the average ink pot." Holmes exchanged a look with me. So the message was not only encoded, it was also meant to repel tampering. "Or poison the uninvited," Clay added, already distracted with his analysis. We left shortly after, making our way back through Chelsea's winding lanes. Holmes was silent once again, though his eyes darted across every facade, every alley, as if measuring their secrets. Back at Baker Street, I took it upon myself to prepare tea while Holmes disappeared into his study. When he emerged 20 minutes later, he was carrying a tattered leather-bound volume and his violin, which he placed softly upon the settee before returning to the table with the book. He opened it to a bookmarked page. "Watson, recall the line from the parchment, 'When the shadow lies east and the bell chimes thrice.'" "Of course, that part lingers in my mind." He turned the book toward me. It displayed a diagram of sundial shadow lengths, calculated across seasonal solstices. "Covent Garden's sundial is unusual. It's not positioned on the true north. Rather, it is 5 degrees askew to compensate for Greenwich Mean Time adjustments." "Meaning?" "Meaning that its shadow at true solar noon will point not directly north, but slightly eastward, precisely at 12:15 post-meridian. That's our moment of interest." He stood and paced, hands behind his back. "Now, the mention of a bell is what truly intrigues me. It implies a signal, 3 chimes. Not random, not metaphoric. Actual bells. Likely an earshot of Covent Garden. There's St. Paul's Church at the far end," I recalled. "Their midday bell would carry." "Precisely," Holmes nodded. "We shall position ourselves near the sundial at 12:15 tomorrow, but tonight there is more to learn. We must investigate those closest to the sundial, shopkeepers, lamplighters, anyone who may have seen something unusual before the code appeared." We returned to Covent Garden just before sunset. The crowds had thinned and lamplighters were beginning their rounds. Holmes approached the baker's stall, the same man who had reported the code. "Mr. Elliot, is it?" Holmes asked. "Yes, sir," said the baker, brushing flour from his apron. "You're the detective, aren't you?" Holmes gave a polite nod. "I told you to open before dawn. Did you happen to see anyone loitering near the sundial yesterday morning?" The man frowned. "Not loitering exactly. But there was someone odd around 4, well before I opened properly. Hooded fellow. Stood still for a long while near the sundial. I thought he might be praying, or drunk, but then he left in a hurry. No face I recognized." "Did he carry anything?" I asked. "Just a satchel. No more than a book or 2 in it." "Which direction did he go?" "South, toward the Strand." Holmes thanked the man and we continued. One by one we questioned porters, a newsboy, and a night watchman. Each recalled nothing more than shadows, a figure in haste, or the hush of the square in the fog. At last, we arrived at the nearby vicarage. Reverend Crail, a balding man with a kindly face, met us at the door. "I heard about the code," he said grimly. "My curate was in quite a stir this morning. I thought it was prophetic. You frequent the square?" "Every dawn, morning prayers at 6, but yesterday—" "Ah, yes. I remember now. There was a woman, alone. She seemed lost. She stood before the sundial for a good 10 minutes, reading a paper. Then she vanished down a side street. I tried to call her, but she moved quickly. A woman? Holmes asked, eyes sharpening. How old? Perhaps 30, dressed plainly, a servant's coat but worn over finer shoes. Holmes turned toward me. We now have 2 figures, Watson, one cloaked, one disguised. Both were near the sundial, within hours of each other. This is no solitary act. The shadows stretched across the square as we departed, the evening settling in with a hush. Holmes paused and looked back at the sundial one last time. Tomorrow, when that shadow falls east and the bells chime thrice, he said softly, someone will either come or something will be revealed. And if not, I asked, then we are not the audience this message was meant for. With that, we returned home, both men unsettled, but resolute. The mystery was no closer to unraveling, yet the net around it had grown tighter. As I penned my notes that night by candlelight, I could not shake the feeling that we stood on the threshold of a carefully prepared trap, or the unveiling of a grand design. The following morning dawned grey and dry, a rare blessing in London's autumn. The fog of the previous day had lifted slightly, revealing a crisp clarity in the air that made the bells of St. Paul's Church sound all the more piercing when they rang out across Covent Garden. Holmes and I arrived at the sundial precisely at noon. A uniformed constable nodded at us, having held the perimeter through the night as instructed by Inspector Lestrade. A few curious onlookers had gathered nearby, watching with restrained fascination. Holmes paid them no mind. He moved about the base of the sundial with calm purpose, consulting his pocket watch at regular intervals. Shadow at 11 minutes past, he murmured. Still a touch north. 4 more to go. I scanned the area, noting the usual morning bustle, the fruit vendors arranging their wares, a flower girl settling her baskets, and a boy chasing a paper bag across the cobbles. It seemed unremarkable, almost disappointingly so. Holmes, however, was coiled with anticipation. I knew that look in his eye, the subtle tightening of his jaw. He had seen something, perhaps not with the eye, but with the mind. At precisely 12:15, the bell of St. Paul's tolled once. The sun's shadow fell distinctly east, just as Holmes had predicted. By the 3rd chime, Holmes had turned sharply and fixed his gaze on a man who had just stepped from a carriage across the square. "Well," he said quietly, "our guest has arrived." The man was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a sharply tailored grey suit and wearing a black bowler hat. He carried a slim leather case under one arm. He moved with unhurried confidence, as though he had visited the square many times before. Yet there was something about his bearing, a stiffness in his stride, a wariness in the way he glanced from side to side, that betrayed caution. Holmes did not approach him immediately. Instead, he withdrew to the shadow of a portico. His eyes narrowed. I stood beside him, uncertain of what we were observing. "Note the time of his arrival," Holmes whispered. "Not a minute early, not a second late. He waited until the 3rd bell to exit. This is not a coincidence. You believe he received the same riddle, or helped compose it?" The man approached the sundial and stopped. He looked down at the cipher, then produced a sheet of paper from his case and compared it silently. After a moment, he tucked the paper away and stepped to the eastern edge of the dial's shadow. There, he stooped and appeared to press something into the cobblestones. A small metal object, perhaps a token. Holmes stepped forward. "Now, Watson." We crossed the square quickly. The man rose as we approached, his face revealing no surprise, only mild resignation. He was in his early 40s, clean-shaven, with high cheekbones and a slight scar near his left temple. His eyes, a sharp steel grey, met Holmes's with something close to recognition. "You're Mr. Holmes," he said. "And you are?" "Arnold Pendray," he replied, slipping the leather case beneath his arm. "Professor of Antiquities, and I presume your shadow this morning." What brings you to Covent Garden at such a precise moment? Pendry glanced at the sundial. I followed instructions. A note was delivered to my office yesterday. It read, "Observe the code beneath the dial. Come east at the third bell. Bring what you decipher." You deciphered it? No, Pendry said, almost apologetically. But I recognized some of the symbols. Borrowed from Phoenician numerals. My field is ancient languages, though I haven't seen a script quite like this. Holmes studied him. Did the note contain a threat? Pendry hesitated. Number, merely the implication that I would understand its significance, and that my absence would be noted. And what did you just deposit near the shadow's edge? Pendry reached into his coat and produced a small iron coin. On one side was an unfamiliar glyph, on the other, the number 3. It was in the envelope with the note, he said. I assumed it was part of the ritual. Holmes flipped the coin in his palm, his eyes flickering. This is custom-made, unique to this occasion. Someone has gone to considerable lengths to choreograph this morning's performance. Holmes handed it to me for examination. The weight of it was oddly cold, the engraving precise. I could not tell if it was ancient or modern. It felt like both. Did you recognize anyone watching the sundial yesterday? Holmes asked. Number, but I thought I saw a figure in the upper gallery of the old theater ruins. Someone in a dark cloak standing still as a statue. Holmes's eyes narrowed. That theater has been closed since the fire in '87. Pendry nodded. Exactly, which is why it struck me. Holmes turned sharply toward me. Watson, fetch Lestrade. Have him bring 2 constables and meet us at the theater entrance. Pendry interjected. You think someone's been hiding there? I think someone is watching our progress, and I suspect they have been for longer than we realize. The old theater stood like a forgotten relic, just behind the square, its facade darkened by soot and its windows long shattered. Holmes, Pendry, and I arrived just as Lestrade came striding down the street with his men. This had better be worth the interruption, he said gruffly, but the curiosity in his eyes betrayed him. Holmes led us in through a warped side door. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of mildew. Pigeons fluttered in the rafters above, disturbed by our arrival. We crossed the ruined vestibule and climbed a narrow stairwell to the upper gallery. There, Holmes whispered, pointing to a row of wooden seats. One, near the center, was dustless, recently occupied. Beneath it, Lestrade's constable retrieved a small object wrapped in oilcloth. Holmes took it delicately, unwrapping it to reveal a brass monocular lens, the sort used for reading fine print or observing distant details discreetly. A watcher, Holmes confirmed. Our mystery playwright enjoys their audience. Do you think they saw us? I asked. No, Holmes said. They left before Pendry's arrival, which means they expected him, and more importantly, they knew I would be watching for them. Lestrade grunted. So we have an unknown mastermind, a cryptic ritual, and now a professor of dead languages dropping coins at a sundial. What's next, Holmes? A séance? Holmes smiled thinly. Perhaps, but only if it includes proper invitations. As we left the theater, Holmes turned once more to Pendry. You're not merely a bystander in this, he said. You were chosen. Pendry looked uneasy. Why? That, Holmes said, is what we must discover. Back at Baker Street that evening, Holmes was more restless than I had seen him in weeks. He paced the room, thumb pressed to his lips, pausing occasionally to study the coin under lamplight or to consult one of his many cipher volumes. Pendry had returned to his university with instructions to await further contact. Clay's courier had not yet arrived with any progress on the cipher, though Holmes expected something by dawn. I was midway through organizing my notes when Holmes suddenly halted mid-step. Watson, he said, what if this is not a message at all? I looked up. What do you mean? What if the code beneath the sundial is not a message waiting to be read, but an announcement already made? I stared at him, puzzled. To whom? Holmes's voice dropped to a murmur. To everyone already involved. He moved to the window, staring out over Baker Street as gaslights flickered to life along the road. Watson, I fear we are not uncovering a mystery. We are participating in a performance whose curtain rose long before we arrived. And with that, he returned to his desk, resumed decoding, and spoke no further until the candles had burned halfway to their stubs. The following morning, it was clear and cold. A light frost clung to the edges of the window panes at 221B Baker Street, and the streets below were already coming to life with the sounds of hoofbeats, cartwheels, and the faint cries of vendors setting up for the day. I found Holmes seated at the breakfast table, his plate untouched, his cup of tea grown cold. He was staring intently at a piece of parchment, its edges slightly curled from handling, and his eyes held the peculiar stillness I had come to recognize as a sign of extreme concentration. The courier from Bartholomew Clay had arrived shortly after dawn. Holmes had accepted the rolled message with only a curt nod and had retreated to his chair without so much as a greeting. I'd learned not to interrupt him during such periods of deep thought. Finally, he spoke, quietly, but with unmistakable certainty. There it is. I looked up from the morning paper. What is it? Holmes tapped the parchment. The pivot, the fulcrum, the one inconsistency that renders the rest of the code legible. He kept Clay's message. It was covered in neat annotations, each symbol carefully mapped, several circled, with notes in both Latin and Greek scrawled in the margins. Clay confirms my suspicion, Holmes said, standing now, energized. The code uses a rotating polyalphabetic system anchored by a keyword, though it's hidden within the structure itself. The most ingenious part? The keyword changes with the reader. I raised an eyebrow. Changes with the reader? That sounds like something out of a fairy tale. Not so, Holmes said. The message adapts to the recipient based on a numerical identifier, like the coin Pendry brought. His number was 3. When Clay used Trinity as the base cipher word, a legible message emerged. And what did it say? Holmes crossed to his desk and retrieved another sheet, this one bearing Clay's translated fragment. When the eastern eye is blinded by flame, seek the doorway within the broken mask. The keeper waits beneath the name of silence. I frowned. More riddles. Yes, Holmes said, almost cheerfully. But riddles that now point somewhere. He laid a city map across the desk. His finger landed on a district south of the Strand. Here, he said. There is an old building in this sector, a burned-out estate once known as the Mask House. It was a private club in the early part of the century. Theatrical society. Shut down after a scandal. Fire damaged much of the structure 20 years ago. It has since stood empty, its facade blackened, its gates chained. The broken mask, I said. Indeed. And the eastern eye, blinded by flame, may refer to the east-facing window that collapsed during the fire. I've already sent a wire to the municipal archives to confirm its orientation, but I expect the evidence will support the theory. I looked down at the translated message again. And the keeper? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the window and stared at the rooftops of London. There is a pattern in all of this, Watson, he said. A mind that delights in layers of performance, but always with purpose. The cipher is not merely a puzzle. It's a test. We're being watched. I joined him at the window. You believe the person who wrote the cipher is still observing us? Holmes nodded. Yes, and I believe they expect us to act. But what they do not expect, what they never expect, is for the audience to step behind the curtain. By midday, we had made our way across the city to the edge of the South Bank district. There, tucked between 2 warehouses, stood the crumbling remains of the Mask House. Time and fire had done their work. The roof had partially caved, the once grand archway was covered in soot, and ivy choked the stone columns on either side of the gate. Holmes produced a small set of locksmith tools from within his coat and had the gate open within moments. We slid inside, rusty hinges groaning in protest. The interior was worse than the exterior had suggested. Chunks of plaster littered the floor, and the air carried the heavy scent of damp and decay. Light filtered in through a single high window, the eastern one, its frame blackened and its glass long gone. Holmes moved carefully, his eyes scanning every beam, every tile. We entered what had once been a foyer, then passed into a larger hall, its once polished wooden floor now warped and cracked. "There," Holmes said, pointing to the far wall. An arched doorway, partly collapsed, led into a smaller chamber. Holmes crouched before the threshold and swept his fingers across the floor. "A recent disturbance," he murmured. Dust pushed aside. A footprint too light for a constable's boot. Someone has been here. Recently. We entered the chamber. It was circular, with a low domed ceiling and remnants of faded murals on the walls. Faces painted with masks, now peeling and grotesque. In the center stood a broken lectern and, curiously, a large iron grate set into the stone floor. Holmes knelt at the grate. "Watson, hand me your walking stick." Puzzled, I handed it to him. He slipped it between the bars and used it to prod the stone beneath. After a moment, there was a faint click. The grate shifted. Holmes pulled it open and revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "We have found our doorway." We descended slowly, the only light coming from the oil lamp Holmes had brought. The air grew colder and mustire, and after a dozen steps, we reached a small subterranean room. To our surprise, the space was dry and clean. The walls were lined with shelves containing books, scrolls, and ledgers. In the center was a desk, and atop it, a locked wooden box. Holmes examined the box. A small brass dial was embedded in the front. Around it were etched 5 letters, S-I-L-E-N, the name of silence, I murmured. Holmes rotated the dial in sequence, S-I-L-E-N. The lock clicked open. Inside the box was a single item, a folded piece of parchment and another coin. This one engraved with the number 4. Holmes read the parchment aloud. "To the 4th bearer, the gate you opened cannot be closed. The performance begins at dusk. All players must take their place. One does not summon fire without ash." He looked at me, his expression grave. "There are others. At least 3 who received similar tokens. Perhaps more." "And if we're the 4th?" I asked. "Then someone believes we belong in this game." He folded the parchment and pocketed the coin. "We must not play by their rules, Watson. We must find the others before dusk." As we emerged once more into the daylight, I could not shake the chill in my bones. Something had shifted. The mystery was no longer a mere cipher or a theatrical illusion. It had become something real, dangerous, deliberate, and designed for us from the very beginning. Holmes hailed a cab and gave the driver 2 addresses, one to Pendry's College, the other to Lestrade. He turned to me and said only one thing as we climbed in. "The curtain is rising." It was nearly 1:30 by the time we reached King's College, where Professor Arnold Pendry had his office tucked within the ivy-covered stone walls of the linguistic department. The halls were quiet, echoing with the occasional clack of leather soles on tile, and the smell of chalk and old tomes filled the air. Holmes moved with purpose, offering no greetings, no hesitation. He knew where to go. When we reached Pendry's door, he rapped sharply with his knuckles. There was no reply. He knocked again. Still silent. Holmes pressed his ear to the wood, then turned the knob and eased the door open. The office was dim, the curtains drawn halfway, and a draught moved through the room, rustling a stack of papers on the desk. It took only a moment to realize something was wrong. A teacup lay on its side, its contents pooled across a stack of books. A chair had been tipped over, and a long shard of glass lay near the carpet. Holmes swept in without a word, eyes narrowing. "Watson, look there." He pointed to the far corner of the room. On the wall, just above a bookshelf, was another mark, drawn in that same dark red pigment as the cipher beneath the sundial. This time, it was a single glyph, a crescent joined to a straight line, ending in a flourish like a dagger. "Another symbol," I said. Holmes was already studying the papers on Pendry's desk. He found a page, half written in Pendry's hand, describing his observations of the coin and cipher. The writing stopped mid-sentence. The final ink stroke trailed off the page. "He was taken," Holmes murmured. "Not more than an hour ago, likely as he sat writing this." I felt a chill creep down my spine. But who would abduct him, and why now? Holmes's face darkened. Because Pendry was not just a pawn, he was clueless. He had begun to understand more than his captors intended. He turned to me. "The pattern is accelerating. The moment we reached the masked house, the moment we discovered the second coin and the hidden message, the players behind this mystery reacted. They knew we were too close." He moved to the tipped-over teacup and dipped a finger into the spilled liquid. He sniffed it briefly, then dabbed a bit onto his tongue. Opium, lightly infused, meant to disorient. He was likely dosed before they moved him. Holmes searched the floor and retrieved a piece of cloth. Fine, embroidered with a pattern that did not match Pendry's wardrobe. "This is women's handkerchief linen," he muttered. "Silk-threaded, scented faintly of lilac and ash, the same scent I detected in the theater gallery." "You think the woman Reverend Crail saw at the sundial was involved?" "I think she never left the stage," Holmes said grimly. Just then, there was a knock at the door. One of the college porters stood in the hallway holding a small envelope. "This just came for Professor Pendry," he said, "delivered by hand. No return address." Holmes took it, opened the seal, and read aloud. "To the fourth bearer, one has been taken, as is custom. One has vanished, as is consequence. The next will burn, as is tradition. Dusk approaches. The bell shall toll." He looked at me. "We must find Lestrade. Immediately." We reached Scotland Yard shortly after 2, where Holmes presented the situation with such clarity and urgency that Lestrade set down his pipe and ordered 2 men to prepare for deployment within the minute. "I'll have a watch placed on every street leading from the King's College area," he said, "and I'll alert all hospitals in case Pendry turns up drugged or injured." "No," Holmes said. "That's what they'll expect." Lestrade scowled. "Then what do you suggest?" "Set a trap. We'll use the message as bait. They promised fire. We give them smoke." Holmes outlined his plan swiftly and precisely. Lestrade was to place false reports of a 5th coin being discovered by an informant, a man being held in protective custody near Temple Gardens. The idea was to provoke whoever was orchestrating this macabre performance into action, to expose themselves or their agents. "We need only draw them into the open," Holmes said. "Even a shadow cast in haste will reveal its source." Lestrade nodded. "You'll be there yourself, I assume?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Naturally." By 5 o'clock, dusk had begun to fold across the rooftops, staining the clouds in streaks of violet and grey. Holmes and I took our place in the empty top floor of a boarding house overlooking Temple Gardens. Lestrade's decoy team, 2 plainclothes officers and a false informant, waited in a room just below, supposedly preparing to transfer the 5th coin to the yard. Holmes stood at the window with his collar against the cold. He hadn't spoken in over 15 minutes. His eyes flicked constantly between the street lamps, the alleys, and the rooftop chimneys. "Do you believe they'll strike?" I asked. "I believe they already have," he said softly. Suddenly, a loud crack rang through the air, followed by a burst of flame from the side of the building opposite. People began to scream, running from the scene. A fire had erupted on the second floor of the tenement across the street. Smoke poured out of the windows. Lestrade's men rushed to contain the panic, but Holmes did not move. "There," he said, pointing to the rooftop above the flames. A figure in black darted across the tiles, cloak billowing, face obscured. "Watson! Now!" We burst from the room and tore down the stairs. Holmes leapt 2 steps at a time. Out in the street the crowd had gathered in confusion, but Holmes cut through it without hesitation. We reached the alley just as the cloaked figure descended a fire escape and landed in a crouch. "Stop!" Holmes shouted. The figure turned and bolted, swift, agile, ducking into a side passage. We gave chase. The alleys were a labyrinth, but Holmes seemed to anticipate every turn, his instincts razor-sharp. Finally, in a narrow court boxed in by brick walls, the figure stumbled. Holmes lunged, tackled them, and brought them to the ground. The hood fell back. It was a woman. She was young, perhaps no older than 30, with raven-black hair and eyes that burned with defiance. "You are the fourth," she told Holmes, her voice calm despite the struggle. "You've seen behind the curtain." Holmes pinned her arms. "Where is Pendry?" She smiled. "Where all the players wait. Beneath the mask." Lestrade arrived moments later, panting, his men in tow. Holmes stood and faced him. She lit the fire to draw our attention away, but she made a miscalculation. We were already watching. Lestrade looked down at the woman. "Who is she?" "I suspect," Holmes said. "She is more than just a messenger." He turned back to her. "And you're going to take us to the others?" Her expression shifted just briefly from defiance to dread. "No," she whispered. "I cannot. The gate is already closing." As she was led away, Holmes remained silent for a long time. Then he turned to me, his eyes cold and sharp. "They tried to distract us with fire, but something darker burns behind this." He looked toward the night sky where the smoke still drifted upward like a signal. "They're not just delivering messages anymore, Watson. They're cleaning the stage." And at that moment, I understood. The curtain hadn't merely risen, it had caught fire. The night after the fire was one of the most restless I ever spent at Baker Street. Holmes sat awake, untouched tea cooling beside him, a sheet of parchment spread across his lap bearing the cipher symbols he had practically memorized. He smoked intermittently, not out of comfort, but calculation. Each draw from his pipe was accompanied by a furrowed brow or a murmured observation. I attempted twice to engage him in conversation, but he responded only with distracted monosyllables. Lestrade's men had taken the captured woman, who had refused to give a name, into custody. She had not spoken since her cryptic warning in the alley, despite repeated questioning. Holmes had examined her hands at the station, delicate but ink-stained, and noted the calluses between her thumb and index finger, the mark of a frequent writer or artist. She had, he declared, either copied or composed some portion of the code herself. "Watson," he said finally, as the hands of the clock neared 3. "This is no longer a riddle about language or performance. It is now a question of power." I looked up from my chair where I had been reviewing my notes. "Power? In what sense?" Holmes exhaled slowly. "Whoever orchestrated this chain of events, these ciphers, these timed messages, these disappearances, is constructing something greater than the illusion of mystery. This is a website, and we have stepped into its center." I could see in his face the signs I had come to trust. Not fear, but the sharp edge of resolve, a mind sharpening its tools for confrontation. "I must vanish for 24 hours, he said suddenly. I straightened. "What do you mean?" "I need to speak to someone outside the reach of official channels, someone living in London's darker corners. Mycroft can offer no aid here, nor Scotland Yard. This requires a more theatrical maneuver." He began gathering items with rapid precision. A false beard from his disguise kit, a tattered overcoat, and a small glass vial he slipped into his inner pocket. "While I'm away," he continued, "you must stay at Baker Street. If Lestrade comes, tell him nothing of my whereabouts. Guard the cipher copies and the coins." "And if the others come?" I asked. He paused, then handed me a revolver from the locked drawer of his writing desk. "Then stall them as best you can." He vanished into the London fog before first light, his figure swallowed by the mist like a shadow leaving the stage. The ensuing hours were a test of patience. I stayed within the flat as instructed, flinching at every knock upon the door or rattle of the window panes. I reviewed the cipher repeatedly, trying to see what Holmes had seen, but the more I studied it, the more it seemed like a foreign language designed not for comprehension, but for confusion. Just after noon, a letter arrived by private courier. It bore no return name, only a single mark across the seal. Pendry's coin, symbol, etched in wax. Inside was a folded note. "The final act begins tonight. 8 chimes before midnight. The theatre reopens." I rushed the note to Scotland Yard. Lestrade read it 3 times before slamming his fist on the table. "They're baiting us," he said. "Mocking us." "No," I said. "They're inviting us." Lestrade looked at me sharply. "You sound like Holmes." He would say the same. "We must go to the theatre." At 10 o'clock that evening, a small contingent of Scotland Yard officers, dressed in plain clothes, began to surround the perimeter of the burned-out Masque House. Lestrade and I stood near the main archway, the wind pulling at our coats. The building looked darker than ever, its scorched timbers casting long, skeletal shadows beneath the gas lamps. No sign of Holmes. The first bell struck from a nearby chapel clock, one of the only towers still in operation near the district. The chime echoed across the rooftops. The second and third followed at quarter-hour intervals. Still no movement. Still no Holmes. At the 6th chime, Lestrade turned to me. "If your friend doesn't show soon, I'm calling my men in." "He'll be here," I said, though my confidence was waning. Then, as the 7th bell tolled, a figure emerged from the alley beside the theatre, cloaked, hunched, face obscured. Lestrade raised his hand to signal the men, but I stopped him. "It's him," I said. The figure approached and slipped through the iron gate. Lestrade and I followed. Inside, the theatre was exactly as we had left it, except for one thing. Dozens of candles now lined the aisles and stage, their flames flickering gently, casting a warm, surreal glow over the ruined walls. It was as if the theatre had awakened. On stage, a single chair sat beneath the remains of the proscenium arch. Holmes, now revealed in full, strode toward the stage without hesitation. The rest of us followed at a careful distance. "I discovered our missing player," he called over his shoulder. "Pendry is alive." Gasps passed through the men. Lestrade stepped forward. "Where is he?" "Close," Holmes said, "and you'll see him soon." As he reached the chair, Holmes knelt and touched the floorboards beneath it. He pressed down, and a hidden panel gave way. With a groan of old wood, another staircase was revealed, leading below the stage. "Light the way," Holmes said. We descended into darkness once again. What we found below defied description. The chamber beneath the Masque House had been converted into a sanctuary of secrets. The walls were draped in black cloth, scrawled with glyphs in red paint. Symbols from the cipher adorned every visible surface. At the center of the room, Pendry sat in a wooden chair, dazed but conscious, a bandage around his head and a coin clutched in his fist. He looked weak as we entered. "It's a ritual," he whispered. "A performance with no audience." Holmes moved swiftly to him. "You're safe now." "No," Pendry murmured. "We're all part of it. We were cast the moment we saw the sundial." Holmes turned to Lestrade. Get him upstairs. Quickly." As Pendray was lifted from the chair, Holmes examined the floor around him. There, carved into the stone, was the full cipher, an elaborate ring of symbols centered around 5 points, each marked with a number. Coins. "I finally understand," Holmes said. "They weren't messages. They were keys." "Keys to what?" I asked. "To identity," Holmes said. Each coin matched a recipient's intellect, specialty, and role. One for the analyst, one for the historian, one for the performer, one for the watcher, one for the interpreter. "And you?" I asked quietly. "I was all of them." As the officers began removing evidence and Pendray was escorted to safety, Holmes knelt one last time beside the circle. "They built this as a proof of concept," he said. "A society of intellects tested through riddles, observation, and discipline. It was never meant for the public. It was their initiation." I stood silent beside him. "And what now?" Holmes stood. "Now we dismantle their stage, piece by piece." He paused. "But we keep the script." And with that, he turned away from the circle, from the glyphs, from the fire and mystery and theatre, and walked into the cool air of London's night, already writing the next act in his mind. The days following our discovery beneath the mask house passed in a blur of activity. Lestrade had acted quickly, securing Pendray's safety and making sure the surrounding district was kept under surveillance. The strange cryptic society that had orchestrated the whole affair appeared to have vanished into the ether, leaving behind only questions, confusion, and a trail of unsettling symbols. As we sat in Baker Street the morning after the discovery, the silence between Holmes and me was thick with unspoken thoughts. Holmes had been quiet since our return, pacing the room with an energy that seemed to channel a deeper frustration. His mind was not idle. It was merely turning inward, trying to piece together the final fragments of the puzzle that had ensnared us. I looked up from my notes. "What is it, Holmes?" He stopped pacing and turned to face me. "There's one thing we've missed, Watson." I raised an eyebrow. "Missed? After all we've uncovered?" Holmes' eyes narrowed as he leaned over the desk. "Not what, but who." He sat down, flipping through the pages of a notebook before pulling out a sketch. A rough diagram of the 5 coins, the coins that had been part of the ritual, and the system they had created. Holmes traced his finger over each coin's symbol. "Each one of these represents something or someone. But it's not the structure of the game that matters. It's the identity of the final player." I frowned. "You believe there's another person behind all this?" "Not just a person," Holmes said slowly. "A figure we've been too distracted to notice. Someone whose involvement was concealed by the very setup they created." I leaned in, intrigued. "Who do you mean?" Holmes stared at the sketch for a moment, his mind turning over each possibility, his voice dropping to a whisper as if speaking the name aloud would change everything. "Pendray was never the only player. He was merely the catalyst. We've been looking at the wrong end of the stage, Watson. The final player, our true antagonist, has been in plain sight all along." The realization hit me hard, like a sudden gust of wind. I had missed it. Holmes, however, never missed a detail. I felt the fog of confusion clear as his words sank in. "The final coin," I murmured. "The coin that wasn't accounted for. The one that wasn't found beneath the sundial. The coin we've yet to identify." Holmes nodded. "Exactly." He stood abruptly, his usual fire returning. "I'll need you to gather our notes. There's another piece of the puzzle. One final thread to pull." The final pieces fell into place as Holmes worked, his mind weaving through the tangled threads of deception and misdirection like a maestro conducting an intricate symphony. His eyes were locked on the parchment that contained the cipher, and for the first time, I saw the weight of realization settle on his shoulders. The cipher was never about solving a simple puzzle, Watson. It was a test, one of intellect, patience, and trust. The 5th coin was never meant to be found. It was never meant to reveal itself. It was meant to bring us to a dead end, to force us into a blind alley where we would waste time chasing our own tails. But why? I asked, confused by the complexity of his thoughts. Why create a puzzle if there was no intent to solve it? Holmes looked up sharply. Because the puzzle was not for us to solve, Watson. It was for someone else. Someone who never intended for us to succeed. His eyes locked on mine. The final player, our true antagonist, is not someone we've been investigating. It's someone we've trusted. I felt a chill run down my spine as Holmes turned toward me, his eyes alight with the dangerous clarity of revelation. "Lestrade," he said. We arrived at Scotland Yard just before sundown. Holmes had been quiet during the ride, but I could sense the tension building within him. The suspicion that had been lingering at the back of his mind had taken root and was now fully formed. As we entered the yard, Lestrade was waiting for us, leaning over a desk stacked high with papers. He looked up as we approached, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by a concerned expression. "Holmes," he said, standing, "I've gone over every angle, checked the details you asked for. There's still no sign of the mastermind behind all this." Holmes's gaze never left him as he replied, "Lestrade, what do you know about the final coin?" Lestrade blinked. "The coin? I don't know what you mean." Holmes stepped closer, his voice cold. "You know exactly what I mean. The coin that was never found. The one tied to the player who orchestrated this entire charade." Lestrade's face betrayed no immediate reaction. He remained calm, but there was something in his eyes. Something I hadn't noticed before. A flicker of hesitation, almost imperceptible, but enough to set my instincts on edge. Holmes continued, his voice sharper now. "You've played your part, Lestrade. You've been the one guiding us to each clue, each false lead, but all the while, you've been carefully steering us in the wrong direction." Lestrade took a step back, his hand moving instinctively to his pocket, where I knew his revolver rested. I saw his fingers twitch. "I don't know what you're talking about," Lestrade said, his voice low. "You're not the detective here, Lestrade," Holmes said, a slight smile playing at his lips. "You're a player in a far bigger game." It happened so quickly, I didn't have time to react. Lestrade reached into his coat and pulled out the final coin, the one we had been searching for. He held it between his fingers. "Game's over, Holmes," Lestrade said, his voice chillingly calm. "You've played your part, but you're not meant to win." I stepped forward, but Holmes stopped me with a gesture. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong, Lestrade," Holmes said, his eyes glinting with the finality of his realization. "This was never your game to control." Holmes stepped forward, his demeanor shifting. He was in complete control now. "The truth is, Lestrade, you were never meant to be the mastermind. You were just another pawn." Holmes had anticipated this final twist. He had known all along that Lestrade, a man so intertwined in the investigation, would eventually reveal himself as the final player. A puppet controlled by those pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Holmes had laid the perfect trap. It was Lestrade's desperations and ego that led him to play the final card, revealing his role too soon. Lestrade's face fell as the realization hit him. "You knew?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I always knew. But it's too late now." The room was thick with tension. The pieces were in motion and the game had ended, but for Holmes and me, it was merely another chapter in a long line of mysteries solved. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, shall we call for a drink? It's been a long day." And as we left Scotland Yard, I knew that the case of the code beneath the sundial had not only revealed the truth behind a complex puzzle, but also the extent to which even the most trusted figures could be deceived by the game they played. The days following the confrontation at Scotland Yard felt almost surreal. The city, still recovering from the shock of the fire and the unsettling events surrounding the Mask House, seemed to return to its ordinary rhythm, but for me, the world had irrevocably shifted. Holmes, though as composed as ever, had not been untouched by the revelations that had come to light. We both knew that the case we had just solved was not simply about riddles, codes, or hidden messages. It was about trust, manipulation, and the complexities of power. Lestrade had been detained shortly after the final confrontation. He had been stripped of his position, his reputation tarnished beyond repair. Yet despite the gravity of his betrayal, there had been no sign of remorse. Holmes had always been skeptical of authority, but even he seemed taken aback by how deeply the corruption had run. I sat at my desk, reviewing the final pieces of the puzzle, when Holmes walked in with the same calm, purposeful stride he always carried. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Watson," he said quietly, "I've been thinking." I glanced up from my notes. "About the case?" "Yes," he replied, sitting across from me. "About the game they played and the stakes they raised?" I leaned back in my chair. It was never just about the cipher, was it? Holmes shook his head. "Number, that was just the surface. The true game was about control. Control of the narrative, control of the players. Lestrade was nothing more than a piece on the board, a pawn manipulated by those with far greater ambitions." I frowned, still struggling to comprehend the full scope of what had occurred. But why involve Pendray? Why drag him into it? "Pendray was a means to an end," Holmes explained. "He was an expert, yes. But more importantly, he was someone with the knowledge to understand the cipher. They needed him to decipher their code, but they also needed someone who could be manipulated, someone whose intellect would make him believe he was in control." "And the coins?" I asked. "The 5 coins. Were they just part of the ritual?" "Part of the ritual, yes," Holmes said, his voice tightening. "But also a symbol, a key to unlock the players, each one representing a different facet of the game. The thinker, the performer, the watcher, the analyst, and the interpreter. Each coin was meant to mark the role a person would play in the game, and each coin, in turn, had the power to shape the course of events." "And the 5th coin, the one we never found?" I asked. Holmes met my gaze. "It was never meant to be found. Not by us, anyway. It was a token, a reminder that there were others watching, others who could manipulate the game from the shadows." He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the table absent-mindedly. "Lestrade was the final player, Watson, but he never realized it. He thought he was the mastermind, but in the end, he was just another pawn." I leaned forward, my mind racing with the implications. "And the final act?" "The fire. The woman we captured." Holmes nodded. "She was part of the performance, a distraction meant to draw us away from the true conclusion. She was a player, but she was also a tool, someone whose role was to lead us down false paths." "But why?" I asked, my voice low. "Why this elaborate game? Why involve so many people?" "Because it was about control, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice darkening. "Control of perception. Control of knowledge. In the end, this entire affair was a demonstration of power, of how easily people can be manipulated, how easily trust can be shattered." I sat in silence, contemplating his words. I had always known Holmes operated on another level. Now, in the aftermath of this case, I began to understand the depths of his brilliance and the danger that came with it. The following week was spent piecing together the aftermath of the case. Pendray had been released into the care of his colleagues, though he had been left shaken by the events he had endured. He was reluctant to speak of the ordeal, but Holmes had assured him that the ordeal would remain buried. As for Lestrade, his fate had been sealed. He had been publicly discredited and removed from his position, and though he remained silent throughout the proceedings, his guilt was evident. It was clear that he had been involved in the machinations of the shadowy society, whether willingly or unwillingly. Anyway, he had paid the price. Holmes and I returned to our usual routine, though the weight of the case lingered between us. I had been shaken, not just by the events themselves, but by the realization of how deeply the game had run. The world was not as simple as I had once believed. There were forces at work in the shadows, manipulating the strings of fate with subtlety and precision. As I sat across from Holmes, his mind once again consumed by a new case, I couldn't help but wonder how much he had already deduced about the next mystery before it even arrived. I asked him once, in a moment of weakness, how he could remain so unaffected by the chaos they had just navigated. Holmes had looked up at me, his eyes sharp and piercing, and said, "Because, Watson, the game never ends. It simply shifts. And we, my dear friend, are but players, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not." Later that week, Holmes received a letter, sealed with the same mark as the coin. The message was brief, and yet it contained enough to spark Holmes's interest once again. "There are those who would rather see the world burn than watch it be rebuilt, Watson," he murmured as he read. "But we are not done yet." He turned to me, a glint in his eyes that I'd seen many times before. "It seems our next case is already unfolding," he said, standing to gather his coat. "The game continues." And as we left Baker Street, once more, the weight of the case heavy on our shoulders, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. In the world Holmes had opened to me, there was always another mystery waiting to be solved, another layer of deception to uncover, and a game that never truly ended. I had been swept into it, and now there was no turning back. The performance was far from over. The days after the case had concluded were strangely quiet. The usual bustle of London life continued unabated, but for Holmes and me, it seemed as if the city itself had taken on a new hue, faintly darker, more opaque. The events surrounding the Mask House and the twisted web of deception that had unfolded still weighed heavily on us both. Though Lestrade had been removed from his post and Pendry returned to his work, there was an unsettling quietness that lingered in the air, as though something far more sinister had been only partially revealed. Holmes, however, seemed untroubled by it all. His mind was, as always, already moving on to the next mystery, the next puzzle, the next thread to pull. I had grown accustomed to this. It was his nature to find solace not in the resolution of cases, but in the perpetual chase of them. I sat at my desk, sorting through a stack of letters that had accumulated in my absence, when Holmes entered the room with his usual brisk stride, a note in hand. "Watson," he said, tossing it on the table. "It seems we've been invited to another performance." I looked up, intrigued. "Who this time?" "Not who," Holmes replied with a smile. "What?" He opened the note with a single motion and read aloud, "To Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street. The stage has been set. The final act awaits your presence. Come, and all will be revealed." The keeper. "The keeper," I repeated, furrowing my brow. "Do you know this person?" Holmes shook his head, though a flicker of recognition passed across his face. "The name is new, but the title is not. The keeper has been a reference in certain circles, used to describe those who control the narrative, the unseen hands behind the curtains." I leaned forward. My curiosity piqued. "And you think this is related to the cipher case?" Holmes nodded, his eyes gleaming. "I have no doubt. This is another layer to the game we've already seen unfold. Whoever the keeper is, they are tied to the network we've been unraveling. The cryptic messages, the timed events. It all leads here." He glanced out the window as if gauging the state of the city. "We must go. I suspect that tonight will bring us closer to the heart of this mystery than anything we've yet encountered." As dusk fell over London, we made our way to the address given in the note, an old, seemingly abandoned building in a quieter part of the city, nestled between two narrow alleys. The streetlights cast long shadows on the cobblestone roads, and the air felt charged with anticipation. The building itself was imposing, with dark, weathered brick and a boarded-up entrance. It seemed like a place long forgotten, a relic of another time. Yet, as we approached, Holmes paused and gave a small nod, signaling me to follow closely. Without a word, he stepped forward and pushed open a hidden side door, one that had likely gone unnoticed by the public for years. Inside was a narrow hallway, lit only by the faint glow of candlelight coming from beneath a door at the far end. "This is it," Holmes said quietly, his voice tense with the excitement of the chase. "The final curtain." We crossed the threshold and found ourselves in a small, dimly lit theater. The walls were lined with old velvet curtains, the seats covered in dust. The stage was empty, save for a single chair in the center, under a spotlight that seemed to burn with an unnatural intensity. Holmes walked to the center of the room, his steps echoing in the silence. I followed closely behind, though a sense of unease had begun to settle in my chest. There was something almost ritualistic about this setting, like a performance had been planned long before we arrived. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man, tall and cloaked in black, his face obscured by a dark mask. His presence seemed to fill the room, and his voice, when he spoke, was smooth and calculated, with an authority that sent a chill down my spine. "Sherlock Holmes," he said, his words heavy with meaning. "I've been waiting for you." Holmes did not flinch. "And you are?" "I am the keeper," the man said simply. "The one who has watched the players controls the game. And now, it is time for the final act." I glanced at Holmes, who gave a slight nod, signaling me to remain silent. "You've orchestrated all of this?" Holmes asked, his voice measured, almost conversational. "The cipher, the coins, the messages?" The keeper tilted his head. "Everything has its purpose. The coins were never meant to be found. They were meant to lead you here, to this moment, to the final question." Holmes stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "And what is that question?" The keeper smiled, a dark, knowing smile. "Who is truly in control, Sherlock? Who has been pulling the strings all along? You may have unraveled the game, but there's one thing you've yet to realize." Holmes's expression remained unreadable, but I could sense the tension in his frame. "And what is that?" The keeper stepped closer, lowering his voice. "That you've been a part of it from the very beginning." There was a beat of silence, thick with the weight of his words. For a moment, I saw Holmes's eyes flicker, just the briefest hint of surprise, quickly masked by his usual composure. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper, though I could feel the pulse of fear rising in my chest. The keeper chuckled softly. "You think you've been solving a puzzle, Holmes? That you've been uncovering secrets? You've been playing your role, just like everyone else." Holmes stood perfectly still. "You've been guiding me." The keeper nodded. "All along. Every step you've taken, every clue you've uncovered. It was all part of the plan. You were never meant to solve this case. You were meant to reach this point, this final act, where you would face the ultimate truth." "And what truth is that?" Holmes asked, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. The keeper stepped into the light, his face partially revealed for the first time. It was a face I had seen before. Just briefly in passing, a fleeting encounter. It was Lestrade. The shock of recognition hit me like a blow to the chest. I turned to Holmes, but his face was already unreadable, his mind working in overdrive. The pieces were falling into place, and I knew, just as Holmes did, that this final reveal had been waiting for us all along. Lestrade, the trusted inspector, had orchestrated the entire game. His manipulation had extended far beyond what we had imagined. He was the true keeper of the puzzle, the one who had been controlling every move, every piece, every twist of the mystery. "Lestrade," Holmes said softly, almost in disbelief. "You are the mastermind." Lestrade's smile deepened. "Not just a mastermind, Holmes. I was the only one who truly understood the game. I was always one step ahead, pulling the strings, and now the curtain falls." There was no time for further words. Holmes was already moving, his mind racing, calculating his next move. But the truth was inescapable. Lestrade had won. The game was his, and we were mere spectators, leading to this moment without realizing how we had been played. As the lights dimmed and the shadows closed in, I knew that the final act had just begun. The performance was over, but the repercussions would reverberate long after the last curtain fell. The next few days passed in a strange haze. After our encounter in the theater, the shock of discovering Lestrade as the true orchestrator of the entire affair was not something that could be easily processed. Holmes, as always, remained calm and composed, but there was an edge to his demeanor, a quiet understanding that we had uncovered something far more intricate and dangerous than we had ever imagined. Lestrade had been arrested and taken into custody, though his arrest had come with little surprise. His role as the keeper had been so well hidden, so skillfully manipulated, that it took even Holmes a moment to piece everything together. The coins, the cipher, the riddles, they had all been part of his plan to lead us into the final confrontation. But Lestrade had not simply been a puppet master. He had also been a player in his own right, one who had controlled the game from the shadows. I had spent hours reflecting on the case, trying to make sense of how such a trusted man had fallen so far. I had known Lestrade for years, worked with him and trusted him even when Holmes had his doubts. But now, everything I had thought I knew had been turned upside down. Holmes, of course, had never fully trusted Lestrade. But even he seemed taken aback by the depth of the deception. He had suspected something was amiss, but he had never imagined that the final twist would involve someone so close to us. As we sat in Baker Street one evening, Holmes took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in front of him. I watched him, waiting for him to break the silence, knowing something was on his mind. "It's over, Watson," he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "But it is also just the beginning." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes met my gaze, his eyes sharp. Lestrade was not the end of this mystery. He was just part of something bigger, something that has been operating beneath the surface for much longer than we realized. I sat up, intrigued. "You mean there's more?" Holmes nodded slowly. "The network, Watson. The ones who created the cipher, the ones who controlled the game, they are still out there. They have always been out there, and now, with Lestrade's involvement exposed, they will be forced to move." I felt a chill run down my spine. So, the game isn't over after all. "No," Holmes said, his voice heavy with understanding. "The stage has been set, but the final act has yet to unfold." The following week, Holmes became increasingly restless, as if the revelation about Lestrade had stirred something deep within him. He spent his days poring over newspapers, sifting through old case files, and pacing the room at night, his mind never far from the puzzle that had consumed us both for so long. I, too, found it hard to let go of the case. The truth about Lestrade had shaken me more than I cared to admit, but it was Holmes's words that stayed with me. The game is never truly over. It simply shifts. I had come to realize that Holmes was not simply solving mysteries for the sake of solving them. For him, it was about something deeper, a need to understand the world, to uncover the hidden forces that operated behind the scenes. The events of the past few weeks had been part of that process, but they had also led us to a greater truth. There were more players in this game than we could possibly know. As I sat at my desk one evening, I heard Holmes's voice calling to me from across the room. "Watson, come here," he said. "You need to see this." I walked to his side, where he was hunched over a series of maps and letters. He pointed to a map of London, his finger tracing a line between several key locations. "I've been doing some thinking," he said. "The pattern is more complex than we originally realized. The cipher wasn't just a puzzle. It was a roadmap." "A roadmap to what?" I asked. "To the locations where the game is being played," Holmes said, his eyes alight with excitement. Lestrade was just one piece of the puzzle, Watson. There are others, and they are all connected. He turned the map toward me, showing me the locations where he had drawn lines between different addresses. The locations were scattered across London, some in well-known areas, others in more obscure parts of the city. I believe these are the places where the next phase of the game will unfold, Holmes said. The ones who control the game are regrouping, and they will be looking for new players. We need to be ready. I felt a sense of urgency rise within me. So, we're not done? Holmes shook his head. No, Watson. We are just beginning. Over the next few weeks, we monitored the locations Holmes had identified, watching the movements of certain individuals and groups. There were no immediate signs of activity, but Holmes was patient. He knew that the game would reveal itself when the time was right. One evening, as we sat at Baker Street, Holmes suddenly stood and walked to the window, his eyes scanning the street below. He had been restless all day, and I could see that he was on the verge of something that would bring this new phase of the mystery into sharp focus. There, Holmes said, pointing to a figure standing near the corner of the street. Watch. I turned to look, and I saw the figure he was referring to, a tall man wearing a dark coat and carrying a leather briefcase. He stood still for a moment, glancing around, then began walking slowly toward the alleyway that Holmes had marked on his map. It's starting, Holmes said quietly. They've made their move. We moved quickly, preparing ourselves for whatever might come next. Holmes had always been prepared for the unexpected, but I knew that even he could not predict what would unfold now. We arrived at the alleyway just as the man disappeared inside. Holmes signaled to me, and we crept forward, staying out of sight. The man stopped at a door hidden in the shadows, knocked twice, then entered. We waited several moments before Holmes turned to me, his expression resolute. "This is it, Watson," he said. "The game has come full circle. It's time for us to take the stage." We approached the door, and as Holmes turned the handle, I knew that everything we had worked for, every puzzle, every clue, every twist of fate, had led us to this moment. The final act was upon us, and this time there would be no turning back. The door opened slowly with a creak, and Holmes stepped forward, his usual air of calm and confidence cloaking him like a second skin. I followed closely behind, every muscle in my body tense with anticipation. We were in the heart of the unknown now. The game had reached its final stage, and the stakes had never been higher. The alley we had entered led to a narrow hallway, dimly lit by flickering sconces. The walls were adorned with faded portraits, their eyes following us as we moved deeper into the building. It felt as though we had stepped into another world, one governed by its own rules and mysteries. Holmes paused in front of a door at the end of the hallway. Without a word, he pushed it open, revealing a large, dimly lit room. In the center stood a long table, and around it sat several figures, each of them dressed in dark clothing, their faces partially obscured by hoods or masks. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The man we had followed into the alleyway was standing at the head of the table. He turned to face us as we entered, his face impassive but his eyes sharp. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, more charged, as though a final reckoning was about to take place. Holmes surveyed the room with a calmness that belied the gravity of the situation. "I take it this is where the game reaches its conclusion," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. The man nodded slowly, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Indeed, Sherlock Holmes. You've done well to follow the trail this far. But now, the question remains. Will you play the final game?" Holmes's eyes never wavered. "I'm not here to play games," he replied. "I'm here to end this." The man chuckled softly. "Ah, always the pragmatist. Very well, then. You may consider this the final test." He gestured to the table where a series of items were laid out. 5 coins, identical to the ones we had encountered throughout the case, and a small, intricately carved box. The coins gleamed in the low light, their edges were sharp, their symbols seemingly unchanged. But there was something different about them now, something ominous. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes scanning the table. "What is this?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. "These coins represent the final steps in the game," the man said. "Each one has a purpose, a key to unlock the next phase, but there is only one path forward. One choice, one answer. Choose wisely, for the consequences will be far-reaching." I could sense Holmes's mind working, processing the information as he always did, breaking it down into logical steps. But even he seemed to hesitate for a moment, as though he understood the gravity of what was being asked. "You expect me to choose one of these?" Holmes asked, his tone still even but tinged with a deeper understanding. "Not choose," the man replied. "Understand. The choice is already made for you. The question is, will you accept it?" Holmes's gaze shifted to the box, the one item that stood apart from the coins. He reached out and opened it, revealing a single piece of parchment inside. It was folded neatly, and as Holmes unfolded it, he read the words aloud. "When the final coin is placed, the game ends. But who will play the last hand?" The room fell into a heavy silence as the weight of the message settled over us. It was a challenge, a riddle, but more than that. It was a test of everything we had uncovered, everything we had fought for. Holmes stood motionless for a moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the parchment. Then, without a word, he turned to face the man at the head of the table. "I understand," he said quietly. The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then the game is yours to finish. But remember, this is not just about solving the puzzle. It's about knowing who you are when the final curtain falls." Holmes's eyes flickered, his mind already turning the pieces into place. "So this was never about the coins, or the cipher, or the messages," he said, his voice low but sharp. "It was about the players, those who would follow the path you set, and in the end, it was never about victory or defeat. It was about control." The man gave a slight nod, acknowledging Holmes's insight. "Exactly. Control of the narrative, control of the choices. You see now that it was always meant to bring you here, to make you confront the truth of your own role in this game." I watched as Holmes stood there, his gaze fixed on the coins, the final pieces of the puzzle laid before him. I could see the tension in his posture, the weight of the choice that had to be made. But there was something else in his eyes now, something deeper. It wasn't just solving the mystery. It was understanding the nature of the game itself. "Control," Holmes repeated quietly, almost to himself. "And power." The man's eyes gleamed. "Yes, Holmes. You understand now. The game has always been about power, the power to influence, to shape the world around you, and in the end, it is about who has the strength to wield that power." Holmes stepped forward, his fingers hovering over the coins. He knew that the choice he was about to make would define not just this case, but everything that had led to this moment. The man leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "What will you choose, Sherlock Holmes? Will you take control? Will you become the final player?" Holmes's eyes darkened, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something. Perhaps regret, or the heavy burden of understanding. But then, with a swift motion, he placed his hand on one of the coins. "I choose," Holmes said, his voice steady, his mind clear. "I choose to end this game." The room seemed to shift in that moment, the air thickening with the weight of his words. The man at the table stood, his eyes narrowing in what could only be described as admiration, or perhaps respect. "You have made your choice," he said. "And now, you will face the consequences." Holmes stepped back, his hand still resting on the coin. "The game is over," he said, "but the players remain." The man chuckled softly, his voice trailing into the darkness. "Indeed, Holmes, but remember this. Games are never truly over. They simply evolve. Holmes looked around the room, his eyes sharp, his mind already turning over what lay ahead. Then let's see what the next stage holds. And as the final curtain began to fall, I realized that for Holmes, there would never be an end. There would always be another case, another game to play, another mystery to unravel. But for now, the curtain had fallen on this one, and the performance had ended. But only for now. And so, as Holmes turned and walked toward the door, his mind already drifting to the next enigma, I followed, knowing that the adventure was never truly finished. It had only just begun.